Good morning. Committee of the Whole is called to order, but we'll stay on recess until we reach a quorum. Thank you. Committee hall is called back to order. We do have a quorum. I'm going to speak in reference to the discussion that was brought up yesterday in reference to the rainy day fund. I have a write-up here from my staff of what happened that day. So I'm going to just, please bear with me, folks, colleagues. It first starts out with Senator Taitigui proffers amendment to increase rainy day fund, appropriating $50 million in excess of FY22 general fund revenues, which shall be reserved for the additional pandemic relief and recovery program as authorized by the Legislature. Can you hear me clearly, Senator T?
Mr. Chair, yes, and
You need to let me finish reading it all? Not
yes,
just the
yes,
beginning?
I can
Okay.
hear you clearly. Thank you.
Okay. Senator Rigel asked for a ruling on the germaneness of the bill. Chairwoman Shelton, after consulting with legal counsel, ruled it being germane. Senator Brown spoke in support of the amendment. Speaker Terlai spoke in support of the amendment. And then I asked that my staff would work with OLB on amending the numbers in the bill since the appropriation numbers were changed to reflect the increase in available funds for the GPA credit bill. I asked for a recess for time to retrieve new numbers to reflect the 15 million. My staff communicated with OLB requesting new numbers to reflect additional 50 million to go to the rainy day fund. OLB Chief Fiscal Analyst and OLB Director on the phone with me and Senator Terlahi, the Speaker, and staff to discuss the intent of the amendment. Discussion clarified it was to add 15 million to the rainy day fund. After about an hour, OLB provided new numbers to staff to amend the bill. Staff discussion with legal to ensure the language will do what Senator Taitigui's intent was, or correction, or what Senator Terlai, Speaker Terlai proposed. The 50 million and suspension of the 2% rainy day fund. Legal concurred with the amendment, saying it would do as proposed since the new notwithstanding language supersedes the original language. Amendment was confirmed, reflect new numbers, adding the 50 million. I think Senator Taitigui at the time closed on the bill, asking for support of the amendment regarding the suspension of the second day, the 2% rainy day fund amendment passes. Okay, the 15 million was added. Senator Taitigui offers another amendment with me to ensure the numbers are adjusted to reflect the previous amendment, then added the 50 million to the rainy day fund. Amendment passes. Bill recommended out of the committee of the whole to third reading. We recess for the day. The following morning, the Speaker advises me and staff that the word excess needs to be removed from the language that was added in the amendment the day before. Speaker Talai asked if it is certain that the language adopted from Senator Taitigui's amendment will suffice on the rainy day fund. Staff shared with her that legal was consulted and the language will work. In other words, it'll meet that requirement. Staff advised Speaker to speak with legal for confirmation. She spoke with her. And we move forward with calling the session back to order. Senator Taitigui asked to go back to motions to request one minor change. Amendment proffered to remove the word excess. Amendment passes, back to third reading. Vote conducted, the bill passed. Okay, we have clarification of what happened that day. Now we will now proceed and continue on round one, beginning with Senator Frank Blas. Senator Blas, do you have any questions for the panel at this time? Just keep in mind, folks, we're still on the first round. We still have another round to go.
Thank
Right?
you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the panel for being here today. And, you know, one of the values of being one of the last people during the round is you'd be able to hear a lot of the questions and answers that were given previously. And there were a couple things, and first I'd like to start with Mr. Guerrero. When we first began, you gave a presentation, both PowerPoint and verbal, you know, with regard to, you know, how we came to this, this budget. You happen to have a copy of your oral presentation?
Yes, I do, Senator.
Yeah, no, that, sayang este, it was the one that he read prior to giving the,
Oh, yes, I have it.
okay, well, you know, if it'd be appreciated if we can get a copy of that, because, you know, based on some of the discussions or some of the things you brought up there, I'd like to be able to bring up, and maybe I'll bring that up in the second round, if you will, but, you know, let's go now to a couple things with regard to coming towards the revenues. And maybe this is a question to Ms. Daphne Shimizu, okay? In recognition of you know, the withholding and the corporate taxes, and I know there was a discussion about, you know, although there wasn't a whole lot of businesses that were on, you know, there's still, you had the withholding, there's an increase in that from my understanding. Mrs. Shimizu, is there a way that we can extrapolate from these numbers how much of that actually came from stimulus funding? I think that by looking at how much was dispersed in totality, you can probably come up with some mechanism, a way to figure out, you know, what withholding would have been based on that. Is there a way that we can do this?
I'm sorry, to clarify, you're referring to the revenues or you're referring to the refunds, Senator Blas?
The withholding taxes.
So in the withholding taxes, those are not impacted by those stimulus payments. Those
Okay.
are separate. And in fact, what happens is when to clarify, just kind of share the process, right? In 2020 and 2021, when EIP 1, 2, and 3 were authorized by law, what had happened or what was authorized was a payment of a certain amount to individuals if they qualify. So those advance payments were made to people. However, people may not, and they were based on a tax return that had to be filed. Some people didn't file a tax return, so they may not have received the monies. Some people may not have been eligible because maybe they made too much money, but in the year for 2020 or 2021 later, because their income may have gone down, then they may have qualified. And so, or again, so what would happen is if they did not get the full amount, or if they didn't get any amount, but then they became eligible when they filed their tax return, then they should have been able to receive that money. And those monies, they're called a rebate recovery credit when it's paid out on your return. Those are funded by the federal government.
Okay. So is there any way of being able to extrapolate any information of either taxes received or revenues derived as a result of the stimulus?
Yes, so we can provide the information
Okay.
on how much in monies was received from the federal government
Okay.
for those amounts, yes.
Appreciate it, and if I can get that before I have to come up on the second round, okay?
Yes, Senator
I
Blas.
would truly would appreciate that. Mr. Guerrero, I'm going to go back to you here. And I have more questions with regard to how we got to, you know, what our revenue projections is, but I'll wait until some of that information comes back later. But in the formation of this budget, did you happen to have or was there a meeting that you had with the administration and the governor in particular, with regard to, you know, whether or not the OFB and the governor's office in agreement with the budget?
Senator, yeah, when we were formulating the budget, we did meet with the governor. I gave her the opportunity to provide feedback to the executive budget she submitted. Bear in mind, the budget was submitted back in January. A lot has happened since then. And it seems like, you know, with some of the fixed costs in government of Guam coming into play, which wasn't part or considered in the executive budget, I literally went with her and her financial team to ask if they could maybe shed some light to see whether or not they would like to continue on and utilizing the executive budget as presented, or make some amendments or corrections, or, just providing her an opportunity to give me input on how to go about preparing the budget, considering a lot of things were not considered in the initial submission. And yes, we did talk to her.
Okay, and in the submission, or what was her response, or what did she say with regard to what the numbers are now as opposed to what the numbers that she was looking for?
Well, I also provided her a spreadsheet, showing her, what we were faced with based on what was submitted and where we were, or where we are today. And she was very amenable, basically, to what I was proposing and what we were recommending at the time on how to address the budget. One of the things that I found very amicable was that she was very much in support of a status quo budget to that of FY22. And I found that as a very good first step, a good working relationship, that she was willing to do a status quo. That kind of departed from her initial executive budget request, where she had some increases and decreases in certain areas, certain departments, certain programs that are now being reconsidered based on the fact that she was willing to support a status quo budget.
So she was willing to support a budget somewhat similar to what was provided to her in FY2022.
Yes, that's my understanding.
Okay. What is the difference in the amount difference between FY2022 budget and what is being proposed here today, FY2023?
The authorized level in FY22 authorized is 623 million. What she was proposing in her FY23 budget, I believe, was 695. So there's a difference of almost maybe about $72 million.
And what was OFB's recommendation of what the FY23?
When I gave you the comparison of the $72 million, Senator, it's based on the initial budget act of FY22. But remember, Public Law 36106 amended.
Sure.
Okay, so actually the increase is actually 17
million.
17 million.
Okay. So what she was actually looking for then was a budget that was basically less than 17 million. It could be, depending on when the conversation, it could be anywhere from 70 million to 17 million less.
You can say that, yes.
Okay. What is the reason? Why do we need to increase it?
Well, looking basically at the FY22 level, that's where we're departing from, and just calculating the increase over the executive budget. A good portion of that basically was for salary adjustments. One was for the law enforcement, which is hovering maybe about 18 million, a little more than 18 million. At the time we prepared this budget, DOE was coming in at their teacher compensation plan of about 29.4 million. We also had to include the bond debt service, which increased slightly, about 2.3 million over last year, over FY22 level. The retirement increase based on the new retirement rate. The restoration of the rainy day fund now, which is at almost 14 million, 13.9. And then of that, once you deduct all those, I would say, fixed costs that has become part of the budget that we would have to cover, there was a balance about 4.6 million left that we can play with.
Okay. And I'll get to that in the second round a little bit more, because then I'm looking at the authorities necessary for the periods. But Mr. Carlson, one of the things I found very interesting in testimony that you provided yesterday was when you were asked the question about the transfer authority existent in fiscal year 2022 budget. and whether or not the governor had exercised any use of that transfer authority, your response was 0. Is that correct? Interestingly enough, Mr. Carlson, then can I ask, based on Public Law 3665, which is a $25 million appropriation to DOE for the Local Employers Assistance Program, if you have not used the transfer authority, and the LEAP was not a budgeted item in the fiscal year 2022 budget when we put it together, where did we get the $25 million to give to the local employers?
Thank you very much for that question, Senator Blas. The legislature appropriated $25 million. The governor matched it with $25 million from ARP, and then she went and I believe increased her contribution from ARP by another $7 or $8 million. So there was no transfer authority necessary because this body authorized $25 million from local funds for LEAP. The program was initially a $50 million program. I think when it was all said and done, it became somewhere in the neighborhood of
$62.5 million. I'm very cognizant and very aware of that. But again, Mr. Carlson, I need to ask, knowing that the LEAP payment, $25 million, was not a budgeted item in the fiscal year 2022, where did you get the money?
This body authorized it, sir.
From where? But where? Yeah, we authorized you to use...
From revenues,
we authorized you to use your transfer authority, but you didn't use it.
I don't believe that's accurate, sir.
So then where did we get the money? Because it's not budgeted.
So when we give you this CRER, we mentioned yesterday or the day before, we're going to provide you with a table on page 3 that shows all the legislatively approved appropriations against the excess revenue, to include $5 million for DPW because of the gas tax relief that was passed by this body, and $25 million for LEAP that was passed by this body.
I'm sorry to Mr. Carlson, the language contained in Public Law 3665 says that you will get the money from the general fund. It did not say get the money from the excess fund. As a matter of fact, there is a provision in Public Law 3654, which is the 2022 Budget Act, that basically prohibits the use of excess fund without legislative approval. The law 3654 or 3665 did not say excess. It said general fund, which is the understanding that you use your transfer authority.
No, I don't.
I'm sorry, but the general fund and the excess fund are two different pots. You cannot intermingle excess fund and the general fund. That's been deemed excess. As a matter of fact, thank you. Yeah, I referred to page 3 of this. It clearly states here that you're basically looking at using excess funds. But under what authority? There was no authority to do that. So the question is, where did that money come from? It should not have come from excess fund because it had to be specifically approved here. Why? We just went through an exercise a couple weeks ago with regard to the GPA rate rebate, okay, where the administration came to us and asked us for permission to use the excess funds to do that. It's done for there. It wasn't done for the LEAP funding. And so my question is, where did that $25 million come from? Because if it came from excess, that's in violation of the law.
We do agree it came from the general fund, correct?
No, that was excess. You deemed that excess.
Okay.
Can
we go back a step?
Your
sir?
document right here on your fiscal note says
Can
that.
we go back a step? Can
Sure.
we agree it came from the general fund?
No, it didn't come from the general fund. We can't agree on that. We cannot agree on that because your general fund is where you were supposed to get to begin with, but you didn't, Because if you was to get it from your general fund, you would have needed to use your transfer authority. You didn't use your transfer authority, so where did it come from?
Came from the general fund.
Well, according to this, because we have not seen any document basically asking for permission to be able to get it from there. The general fund, the expense for the general fund was very specific in 3654, which did not include a $25 million appropriation for LEAP. It did not include it there. The authorization to use the money said it comes from the general fund. Mr. Chair, my time is almost up. I wanted to defer the rest of it and for the second round. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator Blas. Senator Peter Terlani, do you have any questions for the panel?
Actually, Mr. Chair, I don't have any questions because all the questions that is coming from my colleague, I kind of understand. And I just, first off, I want to give credit to OFB and the panel up there because, you know, there's questions and significant questions that were brought up by my colleague. And most of the answers I would think is accurate, except for what Senator Blas had mentioned. We're still kind of leery on just where that 25 million came from. But first off, let me just say, because I concentrated on the fiscal year 2023 general funds. And most of the things that I wanted to do is absorb the issues regarding the executive request versus the OFB level. And I want to say, and let me just mention again that I give credit to OFB, because when you look at the general fund, the OFB recommended level, we're talking about, like I mentioned, the executive request versus the OFB level. There's like $4 million that maybe OFB can take the $4 million and spread it out where it's needed, and that's what OFB should do. I don't know where you're going to put the $4 million, but other than that, let me just echo, because when I look at the 2023 general fund, and that's where my concern is at. And I want to say, I want to echo Mr. Cowson, because I'm very comfortable with the 2023 funding level. But I want to echo Mr. Carson, because the way I will interpret what he had mentioned is that today is better than yesterday, and that tomorrow will be better than today, and that the future, the days ahead, will be better, considering the projection that was given to us by OFB and the explanation that came out from the staff, from the panel. And I just want to say to my colleague, thank you very much, because some of the issues that my colleague brought up, I'm not really aware. Because like I said, I'm just concerned about the 2023 general fund going forward. So I want to thank everybody for their input, and that's all that I can say in as far as questioning the disparities of what my colleague has brought up. Maybe we can get those answers later on accurately, because I know that some of the answers that were put out by the panel were not satisfactory in as far as my colleagues are concerned. So I just want to thank everybody for coming here and sharing this moment and discussing the 2023 general fund. But I'm very comfortable with the 2023 general fund funding and moving ahead. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Terlai. My colleagues, Senator Clint was scheduled to be next, but he's not here, and he's aware of, and he did advise me he does not have any questions for the first round. And I have been informed I've been speaking with Speaker Terlai. She won't be here, and she does not have any questions for the second round, but she will be proffering an amendment when we get to the amendment section. All right? Now, my colleagues, we will start the second round on the revenue base on Chapter 1. And we'll begin with Senator Jim, and probably right after Senator Dueñas, we'll recess until 2 o'clock, okay? So Senator Moylan, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the panel. First question I would have, I'd just like to discuss a little further. As an amendment is being passed around, I just need a copy of that as well. To Mr. Guerrero, if we can just once again look at the excess revenue that we're projecting and your explanation, what the CRER is providing, what we have obligated thus far, and then what you're holding in reserve due to the possible eventual audit. Go right ahead. Mr. Guerrero, just reiterate, I have a few more questions after you further explain the excess amount that we're looking at. The 99 million, where the 99 million has gone into, the projections remaining, and the upcoming audit of that amount of money, please.
Okay, thank you, Senator. Based on the current estimate of what we anticipate to generate in excess of the FY22 revenue levels, which is roughly about 99.4 million, 99.5 million, a portion of that has already been obligated and or has been appropriated. I would start out with Bill number 5536, which is now Public Law 3654, appropriated 25 million from the general fund. I take it back. No, there was no amount, but it actually it provided language on how the excess revenues are supposed to be. I can say you should divvy up at the end of the year, and that particular bill noted that 70% of the excess revenues deposited into the income shall be deposited into the income tax refund efficiency payment trust fund, and that's 30% of the excess deposit will be deposited into the rainy day fund. Okay, and it says noted that all excess revenues shall be legislative appropriated. So in other words, whatever is deposited into those two particular funds can only be used through legislation. Okay. Public Law 3665. Yeah, again, provided language to authorize the use of $25 million from the general fund for the purposes of paying the LEAP program. Okay? It's just provided authorization. Okay. Public Law 36105 appropriated approximately 1.2 million, which has to do with the waiving of the levy on the excise tax, automotive surcharge, and mass transit automotive surcharge on liquid fuel tax for 180 days, which I believe began in July, August, September, which is 3 months of FY22, and the remaining 3 months would be the first 3 months of FY23. Public Law 36106, appropriated a total of $41,381,000 to pay for the GPA credit and for the rainy day fund. That's the one that I believe was Public Law 36106. So that one, remember, it was recently passed when we did the GPA credit. Of the $41,381,000, $26,381,000 was for the GPA tax credit, and we appropriated $15 million for the rainy day fund. So the balance to date of what we have of that would be roughly 27.9 million.
That's your balance from the 99?
Yes.
Okay. Are we projecting any more above the 99? When will the... Is there further money coming in that we can possibly increase from 99 to the end of this fiscal year?
If you're asking OFB, based on the trend that we see on the CER report, I'm hoping. I mean, there's a possibility we can collect more, but right now, based on the trends of what we've been collecting as of June, CER 2022, it's the 99.4 is what we're anticipating to collect.
That would be to the end of fiscal year. That's your number that you're using.
To the end of the fiscal year, yes.
And so we're holding, there's still 27 million remaining.
Of the 99 that I mentioned earlier, yes. Of this amount, yes.
And that is your cap. Would that be your cap that you're saying?
To be honest, Senator, I've spoken to the chairman of Appropriations Committee, and I said, last year we were tracking at a pretty hefty amount, which I thought was kind of amazing. And I think the tracking as of the September 2021 CER report was reflecting something like about 62 million in excess, anticipated excess money. And, however, the audit, after it was completed, only certified a total of almost 32 million. So that kind of represents a 51% difference in what was recorded as at the end of the year in the CER report and what was the actual final audit report. So going back to your question, I would not recommend at this point that we utilize the entire 99 million that we anticipate, simply because maybe once the audit is completed and you do your post-closing entries and all the adjustments and everything else, that 99 million might not be the actual number and might even drop lower than that.
Of course, this body is looking for any money we can to appropriate for necessities for the people. When do you expect that audit to be completed?
Well, normally annually, we hopefully try to get the audit anywhere from May to June. This year, the audit came out a little bit late, I believe in July. But hopefully, we normally get it, the government normally gets it in May or June of every fiscal year, the preceding fiscal year.
Thank you. Mr. Carlson, from OFB's explanation on what they see with the CRER and keeping some in reserve about just under $30 million for the possibility of the audit coming up. And from experience of last fiscal year's audit situation where it was 50% less than the projection based on the audit, do you see it, not that you're going to project in the future, but I'm wondering if the CRER this time would be less than such a large difference of what was projected from 64 million to 31 million, about 50%. I'm just hoping that when the next audit comes through that it won't be 50% difference. I'm just wondering if what we learned from last audit and how it's being reported this time, would there be any difference or less of a difference based upon the audit that we're going to have by May or June?
Thank you, Senator Moylan. I'm going to let Mr. Byrne talk about the expenditure portion of the audit. I mean, what we're talking about are revenues received. Then you have the expenditures, and then prior year obligations and other things of that nature. But I'll let Mr. Byrne explain that.
Thank you, Senator. You and your colleagues here have often heard me talk about continuing appropriations and prior obligations. and the fiscal 22 budget provided for both of those to be paid. During the course of the year, we have had to disperse sums of money for prior obligations, and these are notified to the Speaker 5 days before we are required to disperse them. But we also have quite a lot of continuing obligations that have been dispersed during the course of the year. And it was my recommendation that we did not include those in the fiscal 23 budget. These are the main reasons for the difference between the additional revenues that were realized and the resultant effect on the fund balance, because it's a balance sheet, and on one side you have revenues and the other side you have expenditures, and you deduct one from the other in order to get what the eventual accounting surplus is. So there are no provisions for that in the bill before us, and I sincerely hope that that stays. And if it does, fiscal 23, we will see a better correlation between the revenues and the fund surplus. But as far as 22 is concerned, because those provisions do allow for continuing obligations and continuing appropriations and prior obligations, there will be a difference between what the CRER is saying as additional revenues and what the fund surplus will eventually be.
Very, very good explanation, Director. I appreciate that. Of course, you want to pay off our debts and what we need to. We're obligated, and the faster you can, then we have this money available. So obviously, yes, that should be a good thing to do. At the same time, we're looking at where we can provide money. And one of the things we're looking at, of course, will be primarily a hospital as well, right? And possibly after the audit is completed, and you kind of spend everything you could on these obligations that we have, this body is probably going to want to have the ability to take additional monies to put into things that government services that can maybe even generate more revenue for the government, like the labor and delivery ward, which we know is in dire straits of needing some repairs. Going back, we had a possibility back in, I think it was 2016, even that back long ago, but still nothing has been done. So maybe after this audit, and we know exactly the amount that's available to ensure OFB is comfortable, then we can see if we can obligate something for this budget purpose, maybe for L&D ward as well, to generate income and then to make it comfortable for the mothers and the children being born at our hospital.
Senator, when we prepare the financial statements that eventually get audited, we obviously want to include all the liabilities that we can possibly ascertain, and we talk and we go to all the agencies and units that are reported in the financial statements in a really major effort to make sure that we get all these liabilities reported to us. About 2 weeks ago, we sent out, DOA sent out some instructions for the preparation for the 22 audit. You probably noted that in the management letter, there was one agency that was mentioned in the management letter in that they didn't advise DOA of some liabilities. And when that happens, and when we see that happens, the full fury of DOA descends upon the offending agency in order to make sure that we do include everything. So we will make our renewed attempt to make sure that everything that is out there is included. We have found, of course, that there were a number of liabilities that arose from many years back, and they were just sitting in basically sitting in a drawer. But we are, I hope, reducing that to almost a trickle now by this annual review that we're doing, and that's the point of having audited statements.
Very good, sir. I can see where we're both in having the right interest for the people of Guam and ensuring that our services are well paid for and updated and taken care of to provide this service. So I thank you for your response. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Warren. That completes your second round, okay? Senator Dueñas, sir, do you have any questions for the panel?
Mr. Chairman. I'm going to go through what I consider, and I'll do this with Steve probably first, Mr. Guerrero, would be to establish what I think we're going to be doing in terms of adopting the revenues. By going through and just looking at what I'll call the front of the napkin analysis and see if there's a concurrence. Because, Mr. Chairman, I think it's important. Most of us have been discussing the potentiality of adopting the revenues. I think it's important to also know where the revenues are coming from. The people of Guam that are going to be paying attention to this exercise, and most especially the revenue generators, which is the business community of Guam, fundamentally outside of federal spending, will be watching and be paying attention to how we arrive at a final budget for the government of Guam. So here's my front of the napkin analysis in terms of where I see the revenues coming from. BPT at 5% has basically stayed and tracked what we discussed a long time ago, several years ago, when the BPT went to 5%. The adopted levels in this budget versus the adopted levels prior round out to $63 million additional. That magic number seems to always track whenever we talk about the 1% BPT increase, plus or minus some at $60 million. Mr. Chairman, the EITC windfall is $56 million. That's a given. I consider that a windfall because it's what in industry they call avoided cost. It doesn't have to be budgeted for anymore because it's anticipated and it's already established that a trust fund from here going forward will be an average of years given to us annually for the governor's use, the executive level's use, and it came in this year at $56 million. That is why our provision for tax refunds is not the 125 that we would normally categorize. It is broken out but not considered a revenue at this point, or not considered as being part of that because it's paid for by the federal government that this general fund used to pay for. Corporate tax anticipated is looking at an averaged out between adopted levels last year and a final adopted level at an additional $11 million. Individual withholding at $22 million in excess. Now, I'm going to speculate, but I think it's probably pretty accurate, that additional $22 million and the corporate is probably generated primarily from economic activity with military spending, withholding on all the new employees that have been coming into Guam to assist with construction and contractors and all the other economic activity that's been coming into Guam due to federal spending outside of the spending that was made available and now the completed PUA program and the programs in terms of the withholding that was withheld there from all of that federal assistance under the CARES Act or the ARP and other funding sources. But we're still holding up at the 22 million tracking on the withholding because of the fact that we have so many federal expenditures and so many employees here that are contributing to that withholding at this point. Contractors and per se. I know of actually several hotels that are surviving right now because of the fact that hotel rooms, even higher end hotel rooms, are literally housing workers, particularly in the technical field of electrical, plumbing, and some of the other hard-to-get areas. People that are making very, very good salaries, not necessarily at the basic level of construction, but in the $30 and $40 an hour range. And I round out the anticipated adjustment of now what is not going to be needed anymore as per the declaration from BBMR today on the record, or over the last couple of days on the record, that possibly an additional $8 million in the Section 30. I come out to $160 million in terms of all those differences in adopted levels, but a thorough analysis, at least from my part, speculation on some areas, but true numbers in terms of adopted revenues in 22 contrasted with revenues now proposed in 2023. Would that be a relatively accurate analysis, Steve?
The variances that you noted, Senator, is basically what we have in our spreadsheet. Okay, like you say, the 63 million within the last couple of months with withholding. If you take the average and average that out to the end of the year, you will have approximately about $63 million. What you noted also with withholding is actually on track. What you noted as far as what the governor just recently requested in terms of Section 30 and what we're collecting now is approximately 8 million more. So I can safely say that there's going to be an increase in revenues in FY23. With that said, I also need to note that the expenses for GovGuam has also grown, and I would like to think that in every normal year that the expenses and revenues will grow proportionately. So, there's always enough revenues to cover your growth in expenditures. Now, expenditures you can control if they are those variable type of expenditures, but once expenditures become fixed costs, then that automatically builds into the bottom line. And whether or not, I wouldn't like to say it this way, but you like it or not, that's what we need to address. And that, like you said, Senator, will eat up the potential savings that you just noted. By how much? Again, it just depends on how much that expenditure grows. But I would like to think that we can basically generate more revenues and control the expenditure, so as we move along, we'll always have that cushion of having at least enough surplus, or not surplus, but at least revenues on the side, unobligated to address whatever needs and importance or urgency that comes up in the future, on not having to scramble, not having to increase taxes, not having to do all those kind of things, but still have enough in the kitty to rely on that funding for those type of instances. But you're correct in your assessment.
So, Mr. Chairman, the reason why I wanted to do that, particularly with OFB at this point, and I'm certain the panel would like to maybe chime in on their thought process on this presentation, but what I wanted to do here is to say essentially what we're doing now is we're appropriating because we were conservative for 3 fiscal years in a row, starting with the Trump tax adjustments, and now that tax windfall catching up and creating a lot of economic activity on top of federal spending. Now, the chart that you provided for us is really, I think, where we can at least somewhat agree that the economic activity for federal spending will sustain as we rebuild our tourism going forward. But the issue here now, as we go line by line explicitly through this budget, and where the devil's going to be in the details, is that's what we're doing now, is codifying those obligations that Mr. Guerrero has discussed. Because there's no way, I don't think anybody in this room is going to turn around and say the teachers aren't going to get their raises, or they won't be sustained, or they'll be repealed, or the budget will have to be adjusted somehow within the revenue levels right now, cut a whole bunch of other agencies because, we're going to do it within the budget, and we're not going to do it by adopting these revenues. I don't think anybody's going to go to the police department and say those officers and the potential recruitment of officers going forward is not going to happen because we're not going to adopt revenues, but we're going to adopt revenues that are going to be appropriate to maintaining being conservative while dealing with our obligations that are in front of us. I don't know if we will. I'm going to debate that issue going forward. And then, of course, our nurses, the critical area and the critical things that we need to fund in this government, taking care of our frontline healthcare workers. Absolutely, that has to be a priority. It was done by executive order. It was done by boards and others adopting those critical issues, and most definitely appropriate to have to compensate our frontline workers who are taking care of our health. So health, public safety, education, yes, it's been accounted for. But it was accounted for under an executive order, not in the budget. So here we are now. But I also want to make sure that the people of Guam understand it's accounted for because of all of these revenues that are being realized via manna from heaven from the federal government under EITC that we were paying for so long, under revenues that are generated through federal spend and economic activity, and basically under a 5% BPT. So I wanted to lay that out because I don't know if there will be amendments. We'll have to see in that round, Mr. Chairman. I don't know if there will be amendments to reduce, increase, whatever it will be to this first section of adopting the revenues and then going out and figuring out what our expenditures are going to be. But absent that, absent any amendments to adjust those revenues, that's what we'll be dealing with. And I'm just hoping, Mr. Chairman, you concur with me going forward that accepting the obligations that Steve and OFB have worked very hard on meticulously making sure is taken care of in this budget, that anything in excess to that is going to have to be an absolute true priority. Because for us to throw out all the rules that we established for ourselves over the last 3 fiscal years that got us here, Mr. Chairman, to me would be irresponsible. And my final determination on what I would do in this budget, whether I would vote for it or against it, will be based on whether or not we truly adopted those priorities or we're partying like it's 1999. With that, I'm sure our good friends from the fiscal team would like to comment, but that concludes my second round comments, Mr. Chairman. Suzus Mazi.
Thank you, Senator Duenas. And I think we also, when you mentioned the BBT, we also have to be mindful that what the U.S. Senate had passed, some of the Trump job cut happened 4 or 5 years ago, may change that a little bit. And maybe we can take a look at that BBT increase. Then when the President of the United States signs that, if he signs it. That being said, I wanted to make a statement to make it known that Senator Ada did ask for DRT to provide some information. They have advised that they're putting it together, and hopefully, if not this afternoon, by next week, while we're still in the second round, they'll be able to provide that information that you wanted in reference to, I think, the corporate tax. Maybe you want to comment on that one, not asking the question because we're going to go ahead and recess, but you want to make it clear exactly what you asked for earlier?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And that was the outstanding tax revenues that were the total amount that was outstanding, what was collected, and then what is remaining that's outstanding. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
All right, thank you.
Mr. Chair, if I may. This is also pertaining to information from DRT.
Okay.
And that information would be to provide the info regarding the taxes received by military contracts that have been coming in and how it's determined. I think we did talk about this a little bit before session.
Yes.
and the process, which is very important to understand. The second one is the liability, $19 million liability tax refunds that are still sitting there for payment. How much of that is coming from income tax, and how much is that is still for earned income tax, child tax credit? So there's a separate
All right.
amount, okay?
Okay,
Those are
thank
the
you.
part. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, Daphne, I think you got that. I see her typing away. All right, at this time, we will now recess until 2 o'clock and continue on the second round. Thank you. Thank you, my colleagues.